Okay, Chapter 9, Section 3, Islam and Cultural Encounter, a four-way comparison. So in this particular chapter, we'll learn about Islam and the cultural encounters in India, Anatolia, West Africa, and Spain. The Arab Empire had all but disintegrated politically by the 10th century, and the last Abbasid caliph was killed when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, but the Islamic civilization continued to flourish and expand. In India, the Turkic-speaking invaders brought Islam to India, and with the establishment of Turkic and Muslim regimes in India, that began in about 1000. And at first, there was a violent destruction of Hindu and Buddhist temples, and the Sultanate of Delhi, founded in 1206, eventually became more systematic. And after the conversion of the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, the Turks became the third group to spread Islam after the Arabs and the Persians. There's a series of invasions of northern India that led to the creation of small sultanates. And with the establishment of the Sultanate of Delhi in 1206, it was, like I said, it was more systematic, but it was still relatively limited in its reach. But we see the emergence of Muslim communities in India. Buddhists and low-caste Hindus found Islam attractive. New agrarian people also liked Islam, and the subjects of Muslim rulers converted to lighten their tax burden. Remember, we learned about those that didn't convert paid a heavier tax than Muslims, and so there were many non-Muslims that converted to lighten that tax burden. And Sufis fit the mold of Indian holy men, and that also encouraged conversion. At its height, 20 to 25% of the Indian population converted to Islam, and thus develops the equality of believers versus the caste system, as well as sexual modesty versus the open eroticism that was already present in Indian art. So we have these disillusioned Buddhists and lower caste Hindus. And like I said, many converts came from Buddhists who had left their faith. Those lower caste Hindus are untouchables. Many of them converted. And like I said, there were those that converted to avoid the jizya tax. As South Asia had a long tradition of mystics, Sufism had a great appeal to the common people. And Sufi veneration of saints and various festivals gave Islam a popular practice. And sometimes Sufism was very similar to even Hindu traditions. We also see the split with monotheism versus polytheism. Hindu is polytheism while Islam is monotheism. And that was another one of the factors in these emerging Muslim communities that's very different. But there's an interaction of Hindus and Muslims. Many Hindus served Muslim rulers. The mystics even blurred the lines between the two religions. And Sikhism developed in the early 16th century. It was a syncretic religion with elements of both Islam and Hindu. And there were Muslims that remained as a distinctive minority. So, Islam's base was in the northwest and east part of India, so two opposite ends of India. And like I said, only 20 to 25% converted, and the central and southern reaches saw very little, if any, conversion to Islam. So there was a sharp cultural divide between the Hindu and Muslim communities. And that's where the monotheism and the polytheism comes in. Monotheistic Islam forbade images of the divine, and they preached against the overt sexuality, while Hindu art was full of representations of thousands of gods and sometimes depicted very sensual or even erotic scenes. So Muslims generally lived separate from the larger population, but remained a distinct minority. And here's a map that gives you a good idea of where things are located, the Islamic world in 900, right? The Islamic world by 1300. You can see that it's starting to spread. And then even by 1500. So it had spread in every direction, north, south, east, and west. Not so much south, just a little bit south. Obviously, the Sahara was a major factor in the spread of Islam, but this, like I said, this gives you a good idea. And even Batuta, the Muslim trader we've learned about, shows you some good ideas of his travels. So he went all over the Islamic empire, all over the Islamic world. And this is the Sultanate of Delhi up here in the orange. And the southern parts of South Asia that distinctly really remained Hindu. So you can see that over here in the northwest and then over here in the east were the stronger parts of Islam. And eventually, and we'll get into this when we get to the 20th century, but eventually these countries separate from India and become Pakistan and Bangladesh. Well, Pakistan and East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh. But this at least shows you where Islam took hold in India, or at least was present in India. I don't know about necessarily taking hold, but at least this is where those sultanates were established in India. Okay, Anatolia. The Turks invaded Anatolia about the same time as India. There's major destruction at the early stages in both places, and the Sufi missionaries were important in both places. But Anatolia, by 1500, about 90% of the population was Muslim, and most of them spoke Turkish. So as opposed to speaking Arabic or Persian, they maintained their own language, their Turkic languages. But 90% of the population had converted. And there are different reasons for these conversions. And reasons for the different results in the two regions, India and Anatolia. Anatolia had a much smaller population, so it was faster for them, for the larger percent of the population to convert. 48 million versus 8 million. That's a huge difference. Far more Turkic speakers settled in Anatolia, and there was much deeper destruction of Byzantine society in Anatolia. And with the disillusionment of the Byzantine Empire, it was relatively, I don't want to say easy, but the Muslims were able to come in, and their task was an easier task because of the destruction of Byzantine society that it was already present. And there was active discrimination against Christians in Anatolia. India's decentralized politics and religion could absorb the shock of invasion better because there wasn't one central authority that could fall. Everything was so decentralized and scattered. Remember, we've already learned about how there weren't any real major empires that took hold in India for long periods of time. And so they could absorb that shock a lot better. And the Turkish rulers of Anatolia welcomed converts. There were fewer social barriers to conversion. The Anatolian Peninsula, they suffered a brutal Turkish invasion, destroyed Greek Christian rule, and subjected many communities to massacres. And when the existing state system and social order were shattered, large numbers emigrated into the area, and an increasing number of Christians converted. Many saw that probably as their only option. As both were monotheistic, it made conversion easier than in polytheistic India. And like I said, the 90% of the population by 1500 had converted. And the region had a distinctly Turkish Muslim character in terms of language and culture, and thus establishing the Ottoman Empire. By 1500, this state became the most powerful empire in the Islamic world. And the Ottoman Empire lasted all the way until the 20th century. So Um, very important. Like I said, the Anatolian Turks retained their own culture after they converted. And here's a map that shows you where the Ottoman Empire was in the 1350s, and then 100 years later. So you can see they begin to expand and more and more. Okay, let's look at West Africa. Islam came peacefully with the traders as opposed to conquest, like what had happened in Anatolia and India. And in West Africa, Islam spread mostly in the urban centers. It provided links to Muslim trading partners and also provided literate officials and religious legitimacy to the state. Those Muslim merchants and scholars came to West Africa by peaceful means, bringing Islam with them. The Muslim merchants traveled south across the Sahara. They spread the faith to all those urban trading centers of West Africa, and rulers found Muslim scholars to be useful administrators. And Islam had an appeal as a connection to a wider world. And at those urban centers, Islam was really an urban phenomenon in West Africa until the 19th century. The rulers sponsored the building of mosques and libraries and schools, and there was little effort converting the larger rural world. They really maintained their conversion efforts to the elite and the political leaders. Nonetheless, the communities in the city saw themselves as a part of a larger Islamic world, despite little penetration of conversion going into those lower classes and the mass populace. Remaining, the culture of the urban elite, the villages of West Africa continued to practice their traditions and rituals, despite those that had converted. Sometimes elements of Islam were combined with existing faiths and practices, but there was no Islamization of the region, like in some of the other areas that we've learned. There was no large-scale Arab migration to West Africa either. So, let's look at the 6th century. West African cities were Islamic centers. Timbuktu had over 150 Quranic schools and several centers of higher education. There were libraries with tens of thousands of books, and rulers subsidized building of major mosques. And Arabic became the language of religion, education, administration, even trade. But they did not have, like I said, a distinct Arab immigration to West Africa, and Sufis played very little role until the 18th century, and there was no significant spread into the countryside until the 19th century. So, like I said, little penetration into the mass populace in those lower classes in the rural areas, mainly just with the political leaders, the elite, those high-ranking officials. And here's a map that shows you, in green we see the trans-Saharan trade routes that were used. And this purple outline is the extent of the Islamic expansion from that previous map that we looked at. And you can see the areas of the different kingdoms: Ghana, Songhai, the Hausa states, and Bornu. Of course, diagonal lines, that's Mali. Okay, Spain. Now, the Arab and Berber forces conquered most of Spain, and it was actually called Al-Andalus by Muslims. And they did this in the early 8th century. But Islam did not overwhelm Christianity in Spain. There was a high degree of interaction between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Some Christians even converted to Islam, and Christian Mozarabs adopted the Arabic culture, but not necessarily the religion. In 711, the Muslim, Arab, and Berber forces invaded Spain, and that's the Al-Andalus, that's what it's called in Arabic. They actually quickly conquered the peninsula and established a caliphate. So Islam spread widely in the south. In Cordoba, Spain, this was actually kind of their time for a golden age. At its height, Muslim Spain was prosperous, culturally dynamic, almost cosmopolitan. It was also a time of tolerance. This is where that special tax for the Jews and Christians came in. And as long as they paid that tax, there was a general acceptance of them in society. And at the center of this golden age was Cordoba, the city of Cordoba. This is also a major center for Islamic learning. A number of Greek and Arabic books were collected and translated in many of the libraries. But religious toleration broke down in the 10th century. Increasing war with Christian states from northern Spain. More puritanical forms of Islam entered Spain from North Africa, trying to purify the religion. And in Muslim-ruled regions, there's an increasing limitations placed on Christians. And that's part of the religious toleration. Many Muslims were forced out of Christian-conquered regions or even kept from public practice of their own faith. And that hadn't been the case before. So the completion of Christian reconquest was done in 1492. Notice 1492, that was a very happening year. Lots going on that year. The Christian kingdoms in the north began a series of wars. The Muslim rulers essentially became increasingly intolerant of Christians in Spain, and that was also part of the religious toleration breakdown. A lot of social conflicts that developed between the communities. And through that series of wars, the Christians gradually conquered all of the peninsula, and Granada finally falling in 1492. And the new Spanish monarchy forced many Muslims and even some 200,000 Jews to emigrate. Now, converts, while initially tolerated, were later forced out of Spain. And that is the end of section 3.